Greetings and welcome to another Lessons with Odin. On this episode, we're going to talk more about seed beads. This is another part of the beginners playlist, and just another little buying guide and tip guide as to what to do when you see these giant rows of seed beads in your local bead shop. Last time we talked a bit about shaped. I will leave a link up here or down in the description box below, so be sure to check that out and get up to speed there. Now, in that video I kind of talked about bones versus meat when it comes to structure and choosing bead shapes. Seed beads kind of fill both of those purposes. They can add a expansion to a row, they can also add a lot of support, and they can also fill in gaps. So seed beads are kind of their own beast. I'm going to go over just what beads that I purchase in my personal experience. I'm going to go over the brands that I know of and I work with the most. There are a lot out there, and feel free to experiment as you see fit, but I'm just going to kind of narrow it down and talk about the brands that I'm familiar with. So we'll start off with some basics, first on how seed beads are named. The sizes of seed beads are categorized by number. You'll notice a number /0, which is commonly known as like 11-aught or 11-0. I say O, other people say aught. It's entirely up to you. But it basically burrows down to it used to mean the number of beads that would fit per inch. But because every brand kind of manufactures things differently, it isn't necessarily true anymore. So you can kind of see this comparison with the three most common brands that I work with. We have Preciosa, Miyuki, and Toho. Miyuki tends to be the smallest profile, as well as Toho tends to be the larger of the size. And you'll notice that none of these really fit over an inch. Now, generally speaking, the size differences on the seed beads don't matter too much. However, in some very tight patterns and some very constrictive patterns, the size difference can mean a lot. Therefore, I generally tend to stick with Miyuki as opposed to Toho or Preciosa. Now, the only big differences with these is kind of the shapes. You'll notice that the Japanese versions are a bit more square, and the Czech looks a little bit more rounded, kind of like a donut almost in the seed bead. It's a really subtle difference, but it's kind of just depending on what you like to work with, what you like best. The Czech does tend to be a little bit more on the cheaper side, especially if you get it straight from the Czech Republic, but the Japanese ones are kind of standardized, so you tend to find them more in bead shops and such like that. I have a 15-0 in Miyuki, and you'll notice this takes up about the same amount of space, 15 beads, compared to the 11 beads. So the blue and the green are both Miyuki brand. Now the number over the 0 generally means how small or large the bead is. The bigger the number, the smaller the bead, because it takes more beads to take up the same amount of space. Here I have an 8-0 bead in Miyuki, so 8 of those beads take up the same amount of space as the 11 and the 15s. Now, the range can be large, available on the internet and all around. I've seen 10-0s, but I generally don't use them because, it's not that big of a difference. 10-0 is slightly larger than 11-0, and they can range from, I think the largest I've seen is like 4-0, but those are harder to find, and it's more commonly found in 6-0 on that side of the spectrum. Then there are very, very small, teeny tiny beads on the other side of the spectrum, like there are some micro seed beads that are like 18-0s and 20-0s, but those are like vintage beads, and I don't think they're even manufactured anymore. But they are super tiny and very, I don't know, I have a hard enough time with 15s. I'm not about to work anything smaller, but there are people who do it, and mad props to them. So my personal preference, I prefer to use Miyuki because they are smaller. I'm not too partial to Toho, and Miyuki is also kind of standardized as well. You'll find mostly that Miyuki is sold in a lot of bead manufacturers. They are more expensive, but I don't tend to buy every color under the sun. Again, you don't really need to. Everything looks very pretty, but I try to stick to staple colors. So I'll stick with my gold, silver, bronze, copper, black, and those would be what I buy the most of. If I have another project that might require other colors, I will buy smaller quantities of that one. But when you're starting off, just kind of stick to fewer pieces at the same time. Buy large quantities of what you're going to use the most, and then just kind of take smaller tubes and experiment with what colors you want to advance with. Seed beads are sold by a gram weight, most commonly either 5-gram tubes or 10-gram tubes, sometimes 8 grams, depending on the seller and the finish of the beads. Generally speaking, it's kind of hard to gauge what you need for a project, but as some general kind of guidelines. So if you're doing something like a simple pendant, you're probably not going to use a lot of seed beads, so you probably use about 1 to 3 grams at most, just for a pendant, depending on what you're doing. But something like a bracelet, you'll probably use anywhere from 5 to 8 grams, depending, again, on the stitch, what you're doing, how big the bracelet is, and how complex you plan on doing things. Like, for example, the spiral stitch takes a lot more seed beads because it is nothing but seed beads. And this one uses more shaped beads, so I used very little seed beads on there. This one is also a little bit more seed bead heavy, so I used more on that. And then for a necklace or an entire rope made out of seed beads, you can use anywhere from probably 15 to 30 grams, depending on the stitch, what you're doing, and what have you. This can kind of get expensive when doing necklaces. However, there are places, especially if you're buying like the 10-gram packs alone, but there are places like Aura Crystals or Caravan Beads that sell larger quantities, like 50-gram packs, half-kilo packs. That's good to get when you want to do just like a stash filler, like if you want to keep silver because you use that a lot, bronze if you keep that a lot. Buying larger packs can save you money in the meantime. I personally do not buy every bead size because I don't need to. I buy mostly 11s and 15s. I have a few colors in 8s just because sometimes I need that. 8s are also good to replace things like 3mm beads or 2mm beads. 6s are good for that too if you want to do another pattern but you don't want to shell out for something like Swarovski or something like that and you just want to experiment. Those are good for that size. So another thing you're going to want to consider is generally you get what you pay for when it comes to seed beads. If you go to the craft store and you have those giant bags of seed beads for like $2, you'll probably find a lot of things happen with how uneven they are. You can kind of see this came from the same package. We have some skinny beads, we have some very thick beads, and when you need to have a certain size to perform in your project exactly, and you kind of need the beads to be cut appropriately. Now, I'm not saying that these aren't useful, because especially in bead embroidery, what you can do is if you have a gap that just is too big or too small, you can use one of these kind of beads to fill in the gaps. But that's just something to keep in mind when using a project. If you kind of find that your pieces are kind of wonky, this is something to consider. So now that we kind of go over the sizes of seed beads, let's talk about finishes, because there are differences. There are so many finishes, and I'm just going to go over the most common ones, and there's still a lot. There's a certain vocabulary that's used when it comes to picking out colors, and they have different effects, and they kind of treat your projects differently, depending on what you're going for. So let's start with some basics. First off, we have opaque, which is basically just a color that is opaque. It's not transparent, you can't see through it, and it's just basically a standard color, like so. There's a little bit of a shiny sheen to it, and it's just very nice for, like, making rainbows, but it's kind of a flatter color, so this is an opaque red. And going in a similar vein, there is matte opaque, which is basically the same thing as the opaque, it's just matte. There's no shine to it. It's a lot flatter in color, and it kind of has like a almost grainy texture to it. like it's basically been sanded. And one other complicated finish is the semi-matte. This is kind of like a satiny, it's not truly polished and rugged, it has a little bit of a sheen to it. I kind of prefer the semi-matte over the matte just because it's pretty. But you can kind of see in comparison how this one has a little bit, if I move it towards the light, has a little bit of a sheen to it, whereas the red is completely flat. So, that's just something to keep in mind. I would buy one over the other and just not care about having both of them. So, that's just me. Then we have transparent, which is basically see-through. They're very shiny and kind of see-through. Actually, very see-through, because that's the name, transparent. It's very nice for adding a stained glass effect to your pieces. Then there is matte transparent, which is the same thing as transparent, except it has those polished edges, so it kind of has the sea glass effect to it. Good if you don't want to have some shine, and if you want some more beachy themes, you can kind of work with that. Then we kind of have this pearlized color. And pearls, depending on the brand, can be called simply pearl. They can call it something called Ceylon as well, which I really am not sure where that came from, but they're basically a pearlized version. Sometimes they'll be kind of like a clear-ish pearl coating, and they'll have like a painted interior. Like this one's kind of painted green on the inside. Then there's silver lined, which is basically a transparent color, but it has a silver coating on the inside of it to kind of make the transparent shine and pop a bit. We have this kind of opalized effect in this one. But for example, on this red, we have a bit more of a like jewel-toned, glassy color that kind of makes the silver shine through a bit. So that's just kind of two different effects when it comes to the silver lined. Then there is color lined, which adds a whole new library of combinations. Basically, it's a transparent of one color that has been lined with another color. So for example, this one here is a yellow lined. What do they call it exactly? They call this one Jonquil Apricot. So, you can kind of see the outside is kind of got a yellowy color, and then the inside has this peachy, corally tone in the center that kind of makes this combination kind of pop out a little bit. Whereas this one is just a transparent clear, but it has a pink center on it. So it kind of has this strange effect of like, kind of glass, kind of like a berry tone. It just makes the center pop and make it more shiny. And kind of gives like this illusion effect in a beadwork. Then we have metallic, which is kind of self-explanatory. We have our metallic finishes. These can range from a wide rainbow of colors. These are also more on the expensive side. And you can also get things like silver-plated, gold-plated, and copper-plated seed beads, which are really expensive. Then there is matte metallic, which is the same thing as metallic, but the finish is a bit more polished and rough. So it has that little shine to it, but with like a sanded effect. And then there are these extra finishes that are kind of added, because with these seed beads you can add a whole ton of adjectives to these seed beads. So we'll go with AB finish. This is a transparent AB. If you're familiar with Swarovski or bicones, the AB finish was Aurora Borealis. It just has this very similar, or has this very subtle rainbow iridescence to it, which adds a little bit more depth to the seed beads in place. Then there's iris, which is kind of like an oil slick cover over a base coloring. So for example, these two are pretty much the exact same, except this is metallic and this is matte metallic. So you can kind of see how complicated the adjectives that just get piled on. So when trying to look for this, this would basically be matte metallic teal iris. This would just be metallic teal iris. So this one is shiny, this one is diffused, but you can kind of see that there are variations in the colors. There's purples, there's greens, blues, sometimes a little gold here and there, depending on the type of finish and who manufactured it. And then there's these fun ones, which are etched. They are basically kind of like acid washed seed beads. They're really cool, but they do tend to be on the pricier side because they kind of get fragile with the etching process, but they add a nice little rugged effect to your pieces. But those are the most common effects on seed beads. I just have a few buyer beware pointers on some of the finishes. A lot of the silver lined finishes, the lining can chip away. I've noticed that whenever I'm working with these, I don't like to because I feel it really bothers me when, as I'm threading through things and some of the silver flecks onto my hand, I get kind of antsy about it because to me it kind of feels like fiberglass just being all over my hands, and I'm afraid of getting it in my skin. So Silverline has a bit of a problem with that. And your metallic finishes, Miyuki and I think Toho as well now have a certain metallic called galvanized, permanent galvanized. The issue was with the galvanized is that they used to just wear off and fade. And you can kind of see in this one, let's see, how I've got some of the finish wearing out. This used to be all rose gold. Now it's kind of like this red and yellow from whatever happened. And some of it is tarnishing from the metallic finish as well. But supposedly permanent galvanized is a way to correct that so that the finish lasts longer. The permanent galvanized happens in both opaque colors as well as metallics in the Toho and Miyuki brand finishes. So that's just something to keep in mind. Also something to keep in mind is if you want to buy silver, it's probably best to go and find and look at in person at a bead shop or what have you, because not all silvers are alike. I'm not sure if the camera's going to be able to pick it up, but nope, not really. These two kind of have a subtle yellow tinge to them, whereas this one is more true silver. This one is a Miyuki brand. I'm not too certain on these other two. I think this one's a Preciosa, and I think this one is a Toho. But I'm not too sure. But it's often best to just kind of go to a shop and see this in person because it's really hard to buy online. So another discrepancy in colors is like your gunmetals or your hematites. This one's considered hematite because it's closer to black. We have gunmetal. We have like this burnished aluminum. So the best bet is to find out what you like and just stick with it. And in order to help with searching, I'm going to demystify some of the colors and how to find colors and matching. Miyuki and Toho both have color numbers. All of their beads are going to be given some sort of code. Like, for instance, this is 11 and 9650. So this basically means size 11, and the color is called 9650. So if you Google Miyuki 9650, this color is what should show up. Now, it gets kind of harder when something like this, where a company doesn't really label their beads approximately. So basically, whenever I'm searching and I don't exactly know the number, I will start with basically the finish, and also put seed beads so that Google knows what I'm trying to say to it. And if I know this is Miyuki or Toho, I will put that in there as well. So I'll be like Miyuki, opaque, dark red, matte, seed bead. And maybe if I want the size as well, 11.0. But use kind of your best guess and to figure out, based off of what I've told you about finishes, to kind of say, okay, this is an iris, it's metallic, so it kind of looks like a Miyuki size. So I'm going to say Miyuki, metallic iris, and if you're not too sure about what they call the color, usually bead shops will have the seed beads divided by categories, so you can search for metallic iris and scroll through and try to determine what color is matching to this one best if you don't have a number for it. And from there, you should be able to learn what the number is. So start with a brand, start with a finish, and narrow it down by size, and you can generally find how what color it is based on those results. So the last thing I would like to talk to you about is Delica Beads, also known as cylinder beads. Now, Delica is a brand name by Miyuki, and I don't personally buy a lot of these because they are expensive. But they are known to be much more uniformly cut. They have this cylinder shape compared to a seed bead, so you can kind of see the shape difference on there. These are very good for making very uniform designs, very good for working with peyote if you're just starting, because the shape variation is almost practically non-existent. So if you're doing really flat cuff work like herringbone, peyote, or even some of the tapestries like amulet bags or things like that, Delicas are really great to make sure you don't lose your mind doing them, because it can. I personally do not like peyote. I have an understanding with it, but the results are rewarding when you want to stick with it. Now, there are other brands called treasure beads or even Ico beads, which are slightly cheaper, but they're not as readily available. So I personally do not have experience with them, and I generally don't buy a lot of Delicas in the first place, because again, the price point is just kind of eh. So, like, if I'm doing a tapestry or an amulet bag of some form, I have a huge box of leftovers from a project, because I had to buy, 90 colors that were key-coded. Because Delicas are also numbered. So if you can look by the Delica number, you'll find a match real quickly. But generally, I kind of use these for spacers or for other stitches that just kind of need something more rigid and structural. But other than that, regular round seed beads will probably take you where you need. And with that, I think that concludes this primer on seed beads. That was a lot of information, so if you have questions, leave them in the comments down below, or come join us at our Facebook group at Creations from Lessons with Odin and ask around, because there are some fantastic people who will be happy to help, even if I do not get to it. So, that's just kind of a thing, keep in mind. My most basic sizes that I buy are size 15-0, size 11-0, with the occasional size 8-0. Don't buy too many colors, don't buy every color that meets your fancy, unless you're doing something like loom weaving or stitching that requires different colors. Just kinda keep it simple, experiment with small packages of other colors, and then have a stash of your basic primary colors that you work with the most. So that pretty much concludes it for this video in the beginner's classes. Next time I'm probably gonna start going over some techniques. If there are any jewelry supply guides that you would like me to go over, there's not a whole lot else that I could do, possibly. Maybe wire, maybe threads, something along those lines, but generally with the bead shapes and the seed beads, this kind of covers a whole territory of, a good primary territory of jewelry making. So, I think that will do it for me. Be sure to like up this video and subscribe if you want to see more bullshit from me. Check out my other jewelry shenanigans here on YouTube. I do a lot of different tutorials. I have a very unique aesthetic that is very pointy that a lot of people enjoy. And if you have any suggestions, recommendations, feel free to leave them down below. Check out my Skillshare classes if you want some more advanced classes. Check out the playlist for beginners and get ideas for where you want to start. And also check out my other shenanigans here on YouTube, because I do a lot more than just jewelry making to humiliate myself on the internet. And finally, check out my SciFi if you're into interesting cyberpunk worlds with a variety of characters, diverse characters, and such. My writing blog will be down below. Thank you all so much for joining me, and of course, if there's anything I need to be trying out right now, feel free to let me know down below. I will see you next time.